The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked between a water bill and a catalogue from an auction house in Edinburgh. Elena Marsh almost missed it. She had been rushing out the door with her coat half on and her bag slung over one shoulder, and her mind was already 3 hours ahead at the conservation lab, where a cracked panel from a 17th-century Dutch portrait was waiting for her careful hands. But something about the cream-colored envelope made her stop. The paper was thick and expensive, the kind that does not bend when you hold it. Her name was written in a clean, careful hand across the front, not printed, written. There was a quality to those letters, a formality that belonged to a different era, that made you slow down simply by virtue of receiving them. She set her bag down on the hallway floor and opened it standing there, still half-dressed for the cold outside. It was an invitation to the Whitmore Hall Charity Gala, a fundraising evening for the Children's Art Foundation, held in one of the oldest privately owned estates in London. Formal dress, 7 in the evening. The date was 3 weeks away. At the bottom, a handwritten note from her employer, Geoffrey Hartley, director of the Hartley Collection. He had written simply, "Elena, your presence would reflect well on the gallery. Please come. Dress appropriately." She read it twice. Then she folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and left for work. She did not want to go. She knew that before she even reached the end of her street. Elena was 31 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher from Coventry, and a man who had spent his life repairing old furniture in a workshop behind their house. She had earned her way into the art world through years of precise, quiet work. She could date a painting by the chemistry of its pigments. She could tell you the name of the apprentice who ground the lapis lazuli in a Flemish masterpiece. She could identify a forged signature by the pressure patterns in the brushwork, a technique so subtle that most people in her field would have needed 3 more years in a conservation lab before it became instinctive. She was good at her job in the way that only people who truly love their work can be good at it. The kind of good that does not require announcement, that exists whether or not anyone is watching. But she was not comfortable in rooms full of people who had been born into money. Those rooms had their own language, their own rules, their own way of making outsiders feel the distance without ever saying a word about it. A look held a half-second too long. A sentence that assumed knowledge you did not have. A laugh at something you had not heard but felt, somehow, was partly about you. She had learned to navigate those rooms over the years, but navigation required concentration, and concentration of that kind was exhausting, and she was usually tired by the middle of the evening, and simply relieved by the end of it. Still, Geoffrey had asked, and Geoffrey rarely asked. He was a man who expected things without requesting them, which meant that when he did make a direct request, it carried real weight. He had also, 3 years ago, taken a chance on her when she was a conservation technician at a smaller institution, had moved her into a curatorial role that was above the grade she was officially qualified for, and had never once expressed regret about the decision. She owed him, in the way that is not transactional but is also not nothing. She told her flatmate Clara about it that evening over dinner. Clara, who worked in marketing and had strong opinions about most things, immediately put down her fork. "You're going," Clara said. "I didn't say I wasn't. You had that look." "What look?" "The look where you've already decided not to do something, but you're waiting for someone to tell you that you should." Elena had no good answer to that, so she ate her pasta in silence. Clara had known her for 4 years and was accurate about her in ways she found both comforting and slightly inconvenient. The next 3 weeks passed in the way that busy weeks do, quickly and without drama. She worked long hours at the conservation lab. She read at night. She went for her usual Saturday walk along the canal. She called her mother on Sunday, and the conversation included a brief mention of the gala, which her mother received with the slightly worried enthusiasm of a woman who has spent her life hoping her daughter will one day walk into a room that exceeds her expectations. "Wear something nice," her mother said. "I was planning to," Elena said. "Not that navy thing." "What is wrong with the navy thing?" "Nothing is wrong with it. It is just very practical looking." Elena went shopping the following Saturday and bought a dress that was neither navy nor practical looking, and she felt, doing this, both pleased and slightly ridiculous, which was perhaps the right combination of feelings for buying a dress specifically to wear to a place you are not entirely certain you want to go. The evening of the gala arrived on a cold Friday in late October. The sky above London had turned a flat, pale gray by 4 in the afternoon, and by the time Elena stepped into the taxi outside her flat at 6:30, the streets were dark and damp with the start of rain. She wore the simple deep blue dress that fell just below the knee. Her hair was down. She wore the small pearl earrings her mother had given her when she finished her master's degree. She did not look like she had tried too hard. She had not tried too hard. That was, in its way, its own kind of decision. Whitmore Hall was on the edge of the city, set back from a long private road lined with old oak trees whose branches arched overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. The taxi turned through the iron gates, and the driver let out a low sound of appreciation that he did not seem to be aware he was making. Elena understood why. The hall was extraordinary, a wide, pale stone building lit from the grounds, its windows glowing gold from inside, its facade perfectly symmetrical. Every line of it designed to communicate that the people who owned this building had been owning things like it for a very long time, and expected to continue doing so. There were other cars arriving. Women in long dresses, men in evening clothes, a photographer near the entrance who flashed at nobody in particular and everybody in general. Elena stepped out of the taxi, paid the driver, and walked in alone. The inside of Whitmore Hall was warm and bright and very loud. The main reception room was enormous, ceilings soaring to painted plasterwork, a floor of black and white marble, long tables draped in white linen loaded with flowers that had been chosen by someone who understood that excess, done confidently, is its own kind of elegance. 300 people filling the space with the particular noise of people who are comfortable being seen, and who have always been comfortable being seen. Champagne moved through the crowd on silver trays. A string quartet in the far corner played something polished and undemanding, the kind of music that contributes pleasantly to a room without requiring anyone to actually listen to it. Elena took a glass of champagne she did not particularly want and moved slowly through the room, looking for Jeffrey. She found him near one of the tall windows, deep in conversation with a man from a Swiss banking institution, whose name she recognized from the list of institutional supporters Jeffrey had shown her the week before. Jeffrey acknowledged her with a nod and a small, satisfied smile, the smile of a man whose instructions have been followed, and then returned to his conversation. Elena understood. She had done her job simply by arriving. She was now free to exist at the edge of the evening. She made her way toward a long wall where 6 paintings had been hung for the occasion, all on loan from private collections, all to be auctioned at the end of the evening. She knew 2 of them by reputation, and 1 by direct experience. A landscape by a minor Georgian painter who deserved more attention than he had ever received. A small portrait of a woman in a white collar that she had been trying to track the provenance of for nearly a year, a task that had so far led her through 3 archive systems, 2 family records offices, and a very helpful librarian in Hertfordshire who had spent 40 minutes on the telephone with her, comparing handwriting samples from the 1880s, with patient, genuine enthusiasm for the detail of the thing. She stood before the portrait and forgot, briefly, everything else. The woman in the painting was looking slightly to the left, not quite at the viewer. Her expression was not quite a smile, and not quite sadness. It was something in between, the look of someone who knows something they have not decided whether to share. It was an expression Elena had only seen in perhaps a dozen paintings in her career, and it always stopped her when she encountered it. The paint surface was in beautiful condition for its age. The light fell across the woman's collar and the pearl at her ear with a gentleness that only came from a painter who had spent a long time studying the particular way light behaves when it enters a room from a northern window in winter, who had been interested not just in capturing the light but in understanding it. "You are reading it," said a voice beside her. She turned. The man standing next to her was tall, with dark hair that needed cutting and a way of holding himself that suggested he had stopped thinking about posture a long time ago, because it had simply become natural. He was wearing a dark evening suit, well cut, slightly informal in the way of a man who wore such things often enough not to feel dressed up in them. He was looking at the painting, not at her, which she found immediately less threatening than if he had been looking at her. "Excuse me?" she said. "Most people at these things look at paintings," he said. "You are reading it. There is a difference." She considered this. He was right, and it was an accurate observation, and the accuracy of it made her more willing to continue the conversation than she would otherwise have been. "I have been trying to find out where it came from for a while," she said. "The provenance records stop in 1887. What do you think happened to them? Fire, most likely, or a family that did not think the paperwork was worth keeping." She paused. "The light source is unusual. It comes from the left, but there is a secondary reflection here." She indicated the woman's collar without touching the canvas. "That suggests the painter positioned a mirror to the right. It is a technique you see in Delft workshops in the early 1660s. The light becomes doubled and softer at the same time. Most people do not notice it unless they know what they are looking for." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have had that painting for 6 years and I have never noticed that." She turned to look at him properly. "It is yours?" "It belonged to my grandfather first. He bought it at an estate sale in Norfolk in 1961, and nobody in the family has ever known quite what to do with it, because nobody has ever known quite what it is." He finally looked at her. His eyes were a calm, clear gray. "I am Dorian Ashworth." She shook his hand. "Elena Marsh. I work for the Hartley Collection." "You are a conservator?" "Curator, mostly. Some conservation work when the situation calls for it." She looked back at the portrait. The signature was removed. You can see the slight texture change in the lower right corner if you look at the right angle under direct light. Someone scraped it, probably in the 19th century. It suggests the original owner had a reason to want the connection gone. That is unusual because it was more common to paint over signatures than to remove them mechanically. So whoever did this was making a deliberate effort. "Could you find where it came from?" he asked. "The provenance?" "It is possible. It would take time, and it might not lead anywhere conclusive. Provenance trails from this period often get you very close, and then the last connection is a burned archive, or a family that sold everything without documentation and left no paper trail behind them at all." "I have time," he said, and then, unexpectedly, he smiled. The smile changed his face completely, made him look younger and less arranged, took the formality out of him, and replaced it with something much more interesting. "Would you like to tell me more about the mirror?" They moved to the end of the room, near the tall doors that opened onto the garden terrace, where the noise of the party was slightly less, and the cold air came through the gap around the doors, and Elena was glad of it, because the room had become very warm. She talked about the painting. He asked good questions, not the questions of someone trying to appear interested while actually thinking about something else, but the questions of someone who actually wanted to know the answers and was prepared to follow them wherever they went. He had studied history at Cambridge, he told her. He had a particular interest in the Dutch Golden Age, which had been the subject of his dissertation, and this she had not expected. It revised her initial assessment of him as someone who collected paintings the way certain men collect the right kind of car. He spoke about the period with the ease of someone who had spent real time in it, not just reading about it but thinking it through, turning it over. She told him about a painting she had restored 3 years before, a small domestic interior, nothing famous, just a woman at a table with a candle and a book. The kind of painting that had been bought because it was pretty and had hung on a wall because there was space for it, and how she had discovered when she cleaned the surface in the conservation lab that the woman in the painting had originally been smiling. The painter had altered the expression sometime after the first sitting. The smile had been painted over with a more neutral, more composed face, done carefully but not carefully enough to survive 3 centuries and the right solvents. A smile painted over. She had spent weeks trying to understand why. Dorian listened to this story without interrupting. He did not look at the room around them. He did not check his phone. When she finished, he said, "What do you think the reason was?" "I do not know," she said. "I have thought about it often. Maybe the woman asked him to change it. Maybe she felt a smile was too informal for a portrait that would hang in her family's home for 100 years and be looked at by people she would never meet. Maybe she simply changed her mind between the first sitting and the second. Or maybe," he said, "she had something to smile about when the painting started and did not by the time it was finished." Elena looked at him. It was a quiet, exact observation. She felt the small, particular warmth of being in a conversation with someone who was genuinely paying attention to the same thing you were paying attention to, which was rarer than it should have been at events like this. They talked for perhaps 20 minutes. At some point she realized she had finished her champagne, and he had taken 2 glasses from a passing tray and handed her one, and she had not registered it happening until she was already holding the glass. The conversation moved from painting to the ethics of restoration, to the question of how much change was acceptable before a restored work stopped being the original thing, and then to the question of what things were worth keeping at all. He had a view on this that was more nuanced than she would have predicted. He did not believe that age was inherently valuable. He could say why clearly, with reference to things he had actually thought about, rather than received wisdom he was repeating. "Not everything that is old is worth preserving," she said. "Some things are simply worn out, the material is gone. What remains is just the shape of something that used to exist. And some things," he said, "look worn out from the outside, but the material is still entirely intact." She was not sure, afterward, whether that was a comment about paintings or about something else entirely. At the time, she did not analyze it. She was simply present in the conversation, which was rare enough for her at events like this that she noticed it. Then the evening interrupted. A woman appeared at Dorian's elbow, tall, very polished, wearing a red dress with the confidence of someone who had bought it without looking at the price tag and had never once wondered whether it was the right choice. She was perhaps 35, with the kind of cheekbones that a sculptor would have been pleased to invent, and hair that fell in the deliberate, perfect way of someone who has spent a great deal of time ensuring it looks effortless. She touched Dorian's arm lightly, but with a certainty that communicated ownership in the particular language of these rooms. "Dorian," she said, "the Carrington table is about to sit down. Your mother has been looking for you." He turned. Something in his expression shifted, very slightly, into a different arrangement. The ease went out of it, and something more managed took its place. "Of course," he said. "Cecilia, this is Elena Marsh, from the Hartley collection. She has been telling me about the provenance of the Norfolk portrait." Cecilia turned her eyes to Elena with the brief, calibrated attention of someone taking a photograph for their own records. "How lovely," she said, in a tone that meant nothing at all. "The Hartley collection. Jeffrey's place?" "Yes," Elena said. "Jeffrey is a character," Cecilia said, "in the way that contains a whole system of classification in 5 words." And then she looked back at Dorian, and that was the end of Elena in her attention. Dorian turned to Elena. His expression was arranged again, composed and polite, with a small note of regret that was entirely correct for the situation. "I will have to go, but I meant what I said about the provenance research. If you are interested, please do get in touch through the estate office." "I will," Elena said. He nodded. And then he was gone, Cecilia's hand on his arm, moving smoothly back toward the center of the room where he clearly belonged, and the gap where the conversation had been closed behind him like water closing over something that had briefly broken the surface. Elena stood where she was for a moment. She picked up her champagne glass and found it empty again. She moved back through the party. She found a quiet corner near the auction preview tables and spent some time reading the catalog descriptions, which were competent but missed several things she would have included. She ate something from a passing tray. She spoke briefly to a woman from a gallery in Edinburgh who was interested in the same Georgian landscape Elena had noticed earlier, and they had a useful 5-minute conversation about condition and attribution that was the best exchange she had managed all evening apart from the one that had just ended. It was not until an hour later that the evening changed. She was standing near the entrance to the adjoining room, holding a glass of water, listening to the string quartet play Handel with the relaxed efficiency of people who have performed this program at events like this more times than they have bothered to count. She was not part of any conversation. She was simply standing, resting, the way you do at events when you have used up your social energy. She heard her name, or rather, she heard the word curator, and something in the cadence of the sentence made her certain it was her being discussed. She was not trying to listen. The voice simply carried. It belonged to the Baroness Harwick, a woman she had been briefly introduced to near the drinks table 2 hours earlier. Sharp, amused, carrying the particular projection of someone who had drunk enough to stop calibrating their volume. "Jeffrey's little curator," the woman was saying. "I saw her bending Dorian's ear for 20 minutes by the garden doors. Practically had her notebook out." There was a ripple of laughter from the small group around her. "Poor thing. She was very earnest about it," the woman continued. "One does admire the ambition, I suppose." More laughter. The polite kind, which was worse than the open kind because it required no commitment and left no evidence. And then, clear and unmistakable, Dorian's voice. Easy, light, entirely comfortable. "She does work very hard." A pause. The pause of a man selecting from available options, although perhaps the garden was not the ideal setting for a lecture on Dutch light technique. The laughter that followed was warm and easy and included him fully. The laughter of belonging. The price of admission, paid in 2 seconds. Elena stood very still. The quartet continued playing. The room continued moving around her exactly as it had been a moment before. She set her glass of water down on the nearest flat surface, carefully, with both hands. She walked to the cloakroom. She gave her ticket to the attendant and took her coat. She put it on in the hallway, doing up the buttons with a steadiness that she was aware of maintaining deliberately. She walked to the front entrance of Whitmore Hall and through it, out into the cold October air. She did not cry, not there. She stood on the gravel of the forecourt with her coat wrapped around her, and she breathed the night air, and she waited for the taxi that the doorman was calling for her. The damp came through her thin shoes while she stood. She did not move to the sheltered porch because she did not trust herself to make any decisions more complicated than standing still and breathing steadily. The taxi took 12 minutes. She sat in the back and watched the dark shapes of the oak trees past the window as the car moved down the long drive and back toward the gates. She did not look back at the hall. Its lit windows were behind her, and she kept her eyes forward. She paid the driver. She let herself into her flat. Clara's bedroom light was off. The kitchen was dark and quiet. She did not turn on a light. She sat down on the sofa in her coat and her pearl earrings and her blue dress, in the dark, for a long time. She was not thinking about Dorian Ashworth. She was not thinking about the woman in the red dress or the Baroness or the laughter. She was thinking about the painting of the woman with the changed expression, about the smile that had been covered over with something more composed, more careful, more appropriate for a portrait that would hang in a family home for 100 years, about what it cost to sit still and let someone alter the thing that was true about you, and then hang you on a wall where everyone could see the permitted version. She thought about that for a long time. Then she stood up. She took off her coat and put it on the hook by the door. She went to the bathroom, removed her earrings and placed them on the shelf where they lived, washed her face in cold water, and went to bed. She lay in the dark for perhaps an hour before she slept. She did not replay the evening looking for the version of it that hurt less. She simply let it sit in the room with her, heavy and real and entirely hers to carry, because there was no one else who was going to carry it for her. Outside, the rain fell on the London street. The city went on with its complete and total indifference. Somewhere across it, in a hall full of warm light and cut flowers and expensive clothes, an auction was taking place and bids were being made and the evening was concluding as it had been designed to conclude. Just before she slept, she thought about the woman in the portrait with the changed expression, about the secret that had been painted over, about what it meant to keep something intact on the inside when the world was busy looking at the version you had permitted it to see. She thought, I understand you now. And then she slept. There are mornings that arrive quietly, and there are mornings that arrive like something thrown through a window. The morning after the Whitmore Hall Gala was the second kind. Elena woke at 6, before her alarm, in the way that happens when the brain has been quietly working through the night and decides, without warning, that it has finished, and would now like to be acknowledged. The flat was cold. Clara's radio was already on in the next room, low and murmuring the early news. The sky outside the curtain was the dark blue of a morning that is not yet committed to arriving. She lay still for a few minutes looking at the ceiling. She did not feel anything dramatic. She felt tired in a way that was not about sleep, the tiredness that sits in the chest rather than the limbs, that belongs to the mind having done something difficult without asking permission. She got up, she made tea. She sat at the kitchen table in her dressing gown with both hands around the mug. Clara appeared 20 minutes later, already dressed for a morning meeting, pulling her hair back as she walked, taking in Elena's expression in the way of someone who has lived alongside another person long enough to read a face like a text. She filled her travel mug. She said nothing. She left. Elena appreciated this more than she would easily have been able to say. She went to work at 8:30. On the tube, she gave up on her book after 2 stops and watched other passengers instead. A woman knitting a red scarf in the small space between her knees and the person sitting across. A man in paint-stained trousers eating a roll with complete unself-consciousness. A teenager with headphones the size of small satellite dishes, moving slightly to music nobody else could hear. She found this calming. Other people's ordinary lives, proceeding forward as they always had, unaware that anything had happened to anyone, which was both isolating and, in a strange way, steadying. The conservation lab was in a converted warehouse in Southwark with good north light and the permanent smell of linseed oil and mineral spirits that Elena had always found as reassuring as a familiar voice. She hung up her coat, put on her lab apron, and stood in front of the cracked panel she had been working on for 3 weeks. The panel was a small domestic scene, a woman reading at a table, a window to her left, a cat curled at the foot of a chair. The crack ran diagonally from the upper right corner, following the grain of the wood. The wood support itself was entirely sound. The crack was in the paint layer only, the result of 300 years of the panel responding to changes in humidity, expanding and contracting with the seasons in a rhythm so slow and so small that no human eye had registered it happening, until the accumulated sum of those movements finally showed itself as a visible line across the surface. She began to work. The work required a specific, complete attention that left no room for anything else, which was precisely what she needed from it this morning. An hour passed before she thought about anything other than the surface in front of her. By 11, she had made good progress on the stabilization. She was drinking her second coffee when Jeffrey appeared in the doorway of her workroom. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with white hair and the slightly distracted manner of someone who is always thinking about 3 things at once. He was not distracted now. He had the look of a man who has arrived for a specific purpose and is choosing his words with care. "Good morning," he said. "I am glad you came last night." "It was a good event," she said. "You spoke to Dorian Ashworth. It was not a question." "Briefly," she said. "He has the Norfolk portrait. I gave him some thoughts on the provenance and on the light technique in the surface." Jeffrey nodded slowly, his gaze resting at a point near her shoulder, the particular way he looked when he was constructing a sentence carefully. "There was some comment apparently after you left, about the conversation." She kept her face entirely still. She had long since developed the ability to keep her face still when she needed to. What sort of comment? The Baroness Harwick made some remark, rather unkind by all accounts. You know what she is like. It will have been forgotten by breakfast in all likelihood. He looked at her then, the full direct look he used rarely. I just wanted to make sure you were aware, in case anything circulated. She understood precisely what he was telling her, and what he was choosing not to tell her. She said, "Thank you, Geoffrey." He nodded once and left. She put down her coffee cup very carefully on the workbench. She picked up a fine brush and held it over the crack in the painting without touching it, because her hands needed something to hold. Something had circulated. She had known, standing in the hallway of Whitmore Hall doing up her buttons, that what had been said in that room had a direction and a velocity, and that it would arrive somewhere specific, and that she would be there when it did. She found out what, exactly, at lunchtime, when she called Priya back. Priya answered before the second ring, which confirmed she had been waiting. She had found the Harwick column. She read it to Elena over the phone. The language was smooth and designed to seem light while landing heavily. It described Elena as Geoffrey's young woman from a small West End gallery, who had spent the better part of the evening attaching herself to Lord Ashworth near the terrace doors, delivering what witnesses described as an extended tutorial on the Dutch masters. Lord Ashworth had borne it with characteristic grace. Elena was described as enthusiastic and very earnest, both words placed with the precision of someone who knows exactly how much damage a word can do when it appears to be merely descriptive. "That is it?" Elena said. "That is the main part," Priya said carefully. Elena said nothing for a moment. She stood on the pavement outside the lab, with the October cold coming in off the Thames, 2 streets away. A lorry rumbled past. The ordinary world, proceeding. "Elena? I am here. It is stupid and it will pass." "I know," Elena said. She did not feel the hot, unstable sensation of humiliation she had expected. She felt instead a kind of cold clarity, the way a winter sky looks between weather fronts, stripped back, entirely itself. "I am going back to work." "Call me tonight," Priya said. "I will." She went back inside. She ate a sandwich at her bench. She worked until 6 with the focused intensity of someone who is putting everything available into the thing in front of them, leaving nothing elsewhere. When she left that evening, the crack in the panel was stabilized along its entire length. On the tube home, she did not take out her phone. She had seen enough of the genre of comments that followed articles like the Harwick column to know exactly what they contained. She put the phone in her bag and looked at her own reflection in the dark window of the carriage. What occupied her most was not the public dimension of what had happened. It was the private one. Dorian Ashworth had spoken to her as though she was a person worth speaking to. He had asked questions that required genuine thought to answer. He had told her something true about himself, and she had told him something true in return. The story of the covered smile. And then he had taken that exchange and he had used it. He had turned it into currency in a room where it cost him nothing and cost her everything. He had traded the conversation for the price of belonging, and the transaction had taken 2 seconds and required no visible effort on his part. She had been an anecdote. She had been an anecdote while she was still in the room and had not known it. The next morning, Geoffrey called her into his office. He sat behind his desk with the look of a man who has had a difficult phone call and has been composing himself since. He told her, in the careful language he used for things that were not comfortable to say directly, that he was going to ask her to step back from client-facing work for a short period. He mentioned the Whitmore Hall connection. He mentioned Lord Ashworth's family, and the gallery's spring lending arrangement, which had been in place for 3 years. He used the phrase temporary reallocation, and mentioned the Edinburgh documentation project, which was remote work, important work, work he felt she was uniquely placed to lead. She looked at him. She thought about the 3 years she had spent at his gallery. She thought about the cracked panel in her workroom, and the week she had spent stabilizing it. She thought about the Norfolk portrait, and the mirror technique, and the Provenance trail, that ended in 1887. "That is fine," she said. He looked relieved. She had not given him the resistance he had been bracing for, and she could see it in the way his shoulders settled. She did not give it to him because she had too much dignity to perform her feelings for his benefit, and because she was already, in the cold clarity that had arrived on Friday evening, understanding that what mattered now was not what she said in this room but what she chose to do with the weeks and months that came after it. "I will need until Friday to hand over the panel project," she said. "Of course, take the week." She stood. She shook his hand, which surprised him visibly. She walked back to her workroom and sat at her bench and looked at the cracked painting and the woman reading at the table with the cat at her feet. She worked until 6 every day for the rest of that week. She did the best work of her career on that panel, the kind of work that comes when you have decided that the thing in front of you is the only thing that is going to have your full attention. When she handed it over on Friday morning, she looked at the surface one last time. The crack filled and stabilized, the woman in the painting exactly as she had been in 1664, intact and present, and entirely herself. And Elena felt, very simply, that she had done something real and lasting, and that this was not a small thing even if nobody else in the building would particularly mark it. She went home. She packed a bag. She called her sister Lucy, who lived in Bristol, with a husband named Daniel and 2 large dogs, and a welcome that had no conditions attached to it. "Come," Lucy said, before Elena had finished explaining. "Come tonight. I will make soup." She drove to Bristol that evening through the dark motorway, the city falling away behind her in increments, the orange lights of the suburbs giving way to the darkness of the motorway, and then the darkness of countryside. She stayed for 4 days. She walked on the downs in the November air, the kind of wind that occupies your whole attention and makes thinking about anything specific temporarily impossible, which was exactly what she needed from it. She helped Lucy with the garden. She played with the dogs, who were enthusiastic and uncomplicated, and interested only in movement and food and proximity to the people they loved. She ate soup and toast and apple cake. She slept, deeply and long, in the small spare room that smelled of old wood and lavender washing powder. On the 3rd night, she sat by Lucy's kitchen fire with a cup of tea while Daniel was upstairs putting the children to bed. Lucy sat across from her with her knitting, something green and complicated, and said, without looking up from it, "Do you want to talk about it?" "Not the details," Elena said. Then the feeling. Elena thought about this honestly, the way she tried to think about things that mattered. She turned the feeling over in her mind, until she found the words that were actually right, like I was something someone used without noticing they were using it. She said, "Like I was furniture." Lucy's needles clicked steadily in the firelight. "That is a terrible feeling." "Yes." "And the man specifically?" "He was. I genuinely thought he was paying attention. I thought the conversation was real. And it turned out I was just a thing he was briefly next to before he went back to his actual life." Lucy looked up from her knitting. She had gray eyes, like their father. The family's economy of expression, the tendency to say the most important thing in the fewest words. "That is his failure," she said, "not yours." Elena looked at the fire. "I know that. Knowing it and feeling it are different things." "Yes," Elena said, "they are." She drove back to London on the 4th day. She packed for Edinburgh. She sent Geoffrey a brief professional email confirming her start date. She tidied the flat carefully, the way you tidy a place when you are about to leave it for a while, not out of habit but out of a kind of respect for the life you are departing from. She stood in the kitchen in the morning light, and looked at the space she had occupied for 4 years, with the particular attention of someone who is trying to hold the feeling of a familiar thing before it becomes a memory. She locked the front door. She pulled her bag down the stairs. She put it in the hired car. She drove north through the London morning, the city falling away behind her, until the motorway opened up into pale sky and wet brown fields and the slow, steady turning of wind turbines on a far hill. She turned on the radio. She thought about the Edinburgh collection and the work that was waiting. She had a list of things to find out. That had always been for her the most reliable form of forward motion. A list of things to find out, and the means to find them, and a day stretching ahead that would be filled with nothing except the doing of it. She drove, and the road went forward, and London was behind her, and the work was ahead. Dorian Ashworth woke on the morning after the gala with no particular sensation of having done anything wrong. This was not because he was a careless man, or because he lacked self-awareness. It was because what he had said in the ballroom the previous evening had not registered as an action at all. It had been a reflex, the kind so deeply built into the architecture of a particular life that it operates without conscious instruction, below the level of thought, the way balance operates when you step on uneven ground. He ate breakfast alone in the long dining room of his Kensington house, reading the Saturday papers with the unhurried focus of a man whose weekends still had the shape of privilege. Dorothy, his housekeeper, moved with quiet efficiency between the kitchen and the sideboard, appearing and disappearing without disrupting anything. He ate well. He drank 2 cups of coffee. He read the financial section and part of the foreign news and skimmed the social diary column without particular interest. His phone was beside his plate. Messages from his mother about Sunday lunch. A message from his solicitor about the estate accounts, which he noted and did not open. A message from Cecilia, sent at midnight, "You disappeared after dinner." He put the phone face down. He had known Cecilia Hartwell for 3 years. Their engagement, 7 months old, had the quality of something arrived at rather than chosen, an arrangement that had assembled itself through the logic of his position and the expectations of his family and the social arithmetic of two appropriate people in the same rooms long enough. Cecilia was beautiful and capable and entirely certain in a way he had initially found reassuring, and had more recently begun to find slightly oppressive in a way he had not yet examined directly. She made decisions quickly and with complete confidence. She moved through the world without doubt. He had admired that, in the beginning, and was only now beginning to learn the difference between admiring a quality in someone and being energized by it. He thought about the conversation by the garden doors. Elena Marsh. The way she had looked at the Norfolk portrait, not with the performed interest of someone who wants to be seen looking, but with the absorbed concentration of someone who has completely forgotten to perform. The things she had said about the mirror technique, the secondary light source, the implication that the painter had spent significant time arranging the space before lifting a brush. He had been to more events like last night's than he could reasonably count, and he could not, sitting here with his coffee and his newspaper, remember another conversation that had held him as fully as that one had. He had enjoyed it. He had not enjoyed the end of it. The arrival of Cecilia, the return to the orbit of the Carrington table, the conversation about people he had known all his life that had proceeded with the polished ease of a performance everyone present knew by heart. He had been thinking, as he walked away from the garden terrace doors, that he would genuinely follow up about the provenance research, that he wanted to know where the painting came from. He did not think, eating his toast on that Saturday morning, about what he had said in the ballroom. It had not yet arrived in the part of his mind that required examination. It arrived on the following Tuesday, when his mother called. She was a woman who wore her position lightly and held it firmly, and she had a particular way of raising uncomfortable subjects that made them seem to come from a direction slightly to the side of where she had placed them. She mentioned the gala had been a successful evening. She mentioned the Children's Art Foundation had done important work for many years. She mentioned, in the same even tone, that the Harwick column had been rather pointed about a young woman from one of the smaller galleries. Millicent Harwick has always had a mean streak, Dorian said. Yes, his mother said, in the particular tone she used when she agreed with a statement but felt it missed the larger point. And of course she was encouraged, as she always is, by someone. A silence shaped with precision. He understood what she was not saying. She had known him for 34 years and had a very exact understanding of how he operated in rooms like the one at Whitmore Hall. She knew the calculation he had made. She was not going to name it because naming it was his job, not hers. These things pass, his mother continued, in a tone so perfectly even it could have been used as a spirit level. But you might consider, if it ever comes up again, being more careful about what you allow to become amusing at someone else's expense. She moved smoothly onto Sunday lunch before he could respond. The call ended. He sat with his phone in his hand in the quiet of his study. He reconstructed, honestly, what he had said in the ballroom. He did this without the protective layer of it being a small thing in a busy evening, or a social moment that had gotten away from him, or something the room had produced rather than something he had chosen. He had said, although perhaps the garden was not the ideal setting for a lecture on Dutch light technique, he had said it because Millicent Harwick's voice had been building toward something he could feel gathering force, and redirecting her with a light agreement. A small joke that placed him inside the observation rather than outside it, had seemed, in the 2 seconds it took to calculate and deploy, like the simplest available management of the situation. 2 seconds. That was the full extent of the consideration involved. He set his phone on the desk. He looked out the window at the Kensington Street below. A woman with a dog. A delivery van. A Tuesday morning doing its Tuesday morning things, entirely uninterested in the fact that a man at a window above it was sitting with a realization that was beginning, very slowly, to become something he would not easily put down. He had made a calculation. The calculation had required a person who had done nothing wrong to pay the price for his belonging. He had done it without hesitation because he had been making calculations of roughly this kind for decades, and the cost had never, until this particular quiet Tuesday morning, appeared on his side of the ledger. He thought, that was not well done. And then his phone rang. It was his solicitor, and what followed was a conversation that pushed everything else entirely out of the available space, because the content of it was both urgent and significant, in a way that required his immediate full attention. The estate accounts. His father had been managing the Ashworth estate's finances for 30 years on the principle that certain problems, if not looked at directly, would resolve themselves over time through the general goodwill of circumstances. This was not, it turned out, a principle that held under examination. The estate had debts that were real and compounding. There were arrangements that had existed for decades that nobody had reviewed. because reviewing them would have required the admission that they needed reviewing. There were liabilities that his father had managed by not managing, by letting them sit undisturbed behind the surface of a life that looked, from outside, precisely as it had always looked. He spent the afternoon on the phone. He spent the following morning at his solicitor's office with the numbers laid out across a table, telling a clear story that was less comfortable the more carefully you read it. He spent the rest of that week going through the accounts in detail, and the education the figures provided was more concentrated and more uncomfortable than anything his formal education had offered him. The Cecilia situation arrived at the same time, with the particular timing of a life that has decided to be honest about several things at once. She came on a Thursday evening with a bag and the settled expression of someone who has been composing a final version of an important statement for several days, and has arrived at the one that is true. She sat in his drawing room and looked at him with the directness that was always one of the things he had genuinely respected in her. "I think," she said, carefully, and without dramatics, "that we have been very well suited to an idea of each other, and not very well suited to each other." He considered this. He considered objecting. He found that he could not manufacture the energy to object because he suspected she was right, in the way that you suspect things you have been not quite looking at for longer than you have been willing to admit. "The gala," she said. "I watched you by the garden doors. I could not hear the conversation from where I was. I could only see you, the way you were in it, completely present in it, and I tried to think of the last time you looked like that when you were talking to me." He had tried, honestly, and had found nothing he could point to with certainty. They sat in the drawing room for a long time. It was a civilized conversation, which was perhaps the most honest thing about it. Two people who had been reasonable with each other about the wrong things being finally reasonable about the right one. She left at 9 with her bag. She kissed him on the cheek at the door in a way that was final rather than sad, which is a different quality of ending. He watched the taxi go and felt the particular strange relief of a truth that has been allowed to finally be itself. He went back inside. He sat in the drawing room with the fire that Dorothy had made before she left for the evening. He let the fire burn down to embers without adding to it. He sat in the quiet house and thought about Elena Marsh. He thought about what he had said in the ballroom. He thought about it for the first time without the buffer of other things around it, in the specific quiet of the empty house, plainly and without softening. He had spoken to a woman who was genuine. He had let someone turn that into a joke. He had let himself become the instrument of the joke. He had made a choice in 2 seconds, a reflex so practiced it barely felt like a choice. And the result was that a person who had done nothing wrong had been publicly reduced by it. He thought about the way she had stood in front of the painting, the specific quality of her absorption in it. He thought about the story of the covered smile and the Dutch interior, and the weeks she had spent wondering why a painter had altered an expression. She had told him something real, and he had used it to make 40 people laugh for 3 seconds, and the 40 people had forgotten it by the next morning, and the 3 seconds had cost her considerably more than that. He sat by the dying fire for a long time that evening. The house was very quiet. The estate accounts were in a folder on his desk, waiting for his attention. He was not a cruel man. He had never thought of himself as one. He was a man who had lived so long inside a particular set of rules that he had stopped noticing when those rules required cruelty to function, the way you stop noticing the sound of traffic after you have lived near a busy road for long enough. Through the estate work that consumed the following months, this understanding sat at the edge of his attention, quiet and persistent. He worked through the financial situation with a discipline that surprised even himself. He sold the Edinburgh landscape at auction. He made the staffing decisions that the numbers required. He moved his mother to the Wiltshire house. He worked through his father's annotated books in the library on long evenings and found, in the marginal notes of a man who had been more honest in private than in public, something that surprised him, a different version of his father than the one he had been given. It was Caroline Hartwell, Cecilia's sister, who mentioned Elena's blog. They ran into each other at a private view in Fitzrovia in March, and stood together in front of an abstract painting they could not entirely decode, and agreed that it was probably very good. Caroline mentioned a blog she had been reading, about art, about the margins of it, a piece about a still life and the question of what value means when beauty is identical in the original and the copy, the most honest writing about attribution she had encountered in years. He found the blog on his phone on the tube home. He recognized the voice before the end of the first paragraph, the same precision that had described the mirror technique in the Norfolk portrait, the same quality of looking past the surface of a thing to the question that lived behind the surface. He went home and read everything she had written, from the beginning, over the following 4 days. The reading was not comfortable. Each piece was a clear demonstration of the quality of attention he had been briefly in contact with at Whitmore Hall, and had traded away in 2 seconds. The piece about the man in the dark coat portrait stayed with him longest, about the difference between being seen and being looked at, about presence without acknowledgement. He thought, some things need to be acknowledged before they can properly be set down. He began to write the letter. It took 11 days and many failed drafts. The first version was too composed, the second too brief, the third drifted into explanation, which is what people reach for when they are not yet ready to say the plain thing. Each draft required him to find and remove one more layer of protective language that had crept in without his noticing. The language of context, the language of the passive voice, the forward-moving sentences that moved too quickly past the description of the harm toward the description of what had changed since. The final version was 2 pages, plain handwriting on plain paper. He named what he had done. He used plain words. He said it was wrong and did not dress that up. He wrote about reading her blog with the specificity of someone who had actually read it. He wrote, "I am not writing because I hope for anything in return. I am writing because what happened was wrong, and some things need to be said plainly in order to properly exist. You deserved much better than what I allowed that evening." He posted it on a Thursday morning. He walked to the postbox himself. Then he waited. Not with anxiety. He had done the thing he could do. He returned to the estate work and the library and the ordinary business of his days, which had become smaller and more honest in the months since November, and which was, he was finding, better for being smaller and more honest. One morning in April he woke early and lay in the quiet house listening to the birds and thought, simply, I hope she is well. Not I hope she replies. Just, I hope she is well. It was the most uncomplicated thing he had felt in a long time, and it was entirely true. Edinburgh in December had a cold that felt like it meant something. It arrived every morning off the Firth with a bluntness that Elena found, unexpectedly, clarifying. London cold was soft and apologetic. Edinburgh cold said nothing about itself and required no comment from you either. It simply arrived and stayed, and after a week she stopped noticing it, and after 2 weeks she began to find it honest. She had been in the city for 3 weeks when she understood she had made the right decision, not the decision to leave London, which had in some ways been made for her. The decision about what to do once she had left. The flat was on the 2nd floor of a Georgian terrace in the new town, rented month by month, with tall windows that admitted considerable light and very little heat. She wore a thick jumper every morning, and made her coffee standing at the kitchen window, watching the street below come to life in the 7 o'clock dark. A woman walking a spaniel with the purposeful air of a dog who takes its roots seriously. A delivery driver stacking boxes outside the pharmacy with practiced efficiency. The newsagent's sign coming on at 6:45, illuminating the dark street. From one corner of the kitchen window, if she stood at a particular angle, she could see the upper edge of the castle against the sky. She found this pleasing without needing to analyze why. It was simply there, and it had been there for several hundred years, and there was a kind of comfort in that kind of solidity. The Alderton collection was held at a house west of the city, a solid, well-proportioned building constructed in 1801, in the same family since 1847, now managed by a trust whose members were scattered across 3 continents. Graham Forsyth, the trust's director, met Elena on her first morning in the dining room, with a folder of existing records and the look of a man handing over a problem he is genuinely glad to be handing over. 462 works, he told her. We have records for approximately 230. The records are in 4 different formats spanning 90 years. Some are handwritten, some are on a computer system from 1994 that our IT contact says cannot be read without specialist equipment. He paused. And there is one room on the upper west wing where we have no records at all. We know it contains paintings because we can see them when we open the door. Beyond that, we know nothing. I will start with that room, she said. She began the next morning. The room was on the upper floor facing north, the best light for assessing paintings, cool and consistent, and without the drama of directional morning or afternoon light. It had been used as a smoking room, then a children's playroom, then as a general repository into which furniture and objects had been deposited over a century and a half by people making quick decisions. The paintings had been hung at various points across that time and simply left, because nobody had had a reason to move them. There were 32 of them. She numbered them with small adhesive labels, working clockwise from the door. She photographed each one. She made notes in her plain notebook, not a digital system at this stage, because digital systems require categories and categories require prior knowledge, and she did not yet know enough about this collection to make categories that would be accurate rather than just imposed. The work consumed the full day comfortably. By 4 in the afternoon, the light was changing, and she stopped, gathered her notes, and drove back to the flat through the early dark, feeling the particular satisfaction of a day that had been entirely and usefully occupied. By the end of the first week, she had documented the north room completely. 3 works of real interest had emerged from the careful looking. A portrait with a strong claim to being by a respected Edinburgh painter of the 1780s who had spent the latter part of his career in relative obscurity. A landscape hung high on the west wall where the light barely reached it, which had a compositional structure and handling of sky that made a strong case for being an early work by a name that would attract significant attention if the attribution held. And a still life of flowers, roses, and tulips in an earthenware pitcher that was either a competent Dutch original from the 1670s or a very skilled 19th century copy, and which would require pigment analysis to distinguish between the 2 possibilities. She wrote her preliminary notes with precision and sent the file to Graham Forsyth on Friday afternoon. He called Saturday morning. "Elena, this is extraordinary." "It is a good start," she said. "The landscape will need specialist opinion before any attribution claim can be responsibly made. I have included 3 contacts in the report." She thanked him and ended the call. She put on her coat and her scarf and walked from the flat down the hill to the covered market, where she bought bread and good cheese and a bag of apples and a bunch of yellow tulips because they were there, and they were the color of something cheerful, and the morning was gray. She walked home. She put the tulips in a glass on the kitchen windowsill. She made tea. She sat at the table in the December quiet and thought, this is a good life. Not a finished life. Not one that had resolved everything, but a good one, in motion, pointed in the right direction. The distinction felt important to maintain. She had not stopped thinking about the ballroom. She would not pretend she had, because pretending was a form of inaccuracy, and she had decided that inaccuracy was corrosive to the kind of life she was trying to build. The memory surfaced at odd moments, usually during the automatic, quiet actions of the day, with a clarity that still produced a brief, precise sensation of cold in the chest. Not pain exactly. The memory of pain, which is its own distinct experience. But the quality of the memory had changed. It was no longer raw at the edges. It had become something she could examine from the outside, and set down again, without it consuming the whole of her attention. A scar, rather than a wound. The difference was significant, and she noted it with the same accuracy she brought to everything she examined. She had also, in those Edinburgh weeks, begun to write. It had started on an evening in December when she was eating soup and rereading her notes from the day, and found herself writing, without having decided to, a description of one of the paintings in the north room. Not the technical description in her working notes, something different, beginning with the object but moving outward from it, into the life that had surrounded it, the questions the painting could not answer, the gap between what was visible and what had once been real. She wrote for an hour. The soup went cold. At the end of it she read what she had written and thought, this is something, not finished, but something real. She came back to it the next morning before driving to the house. It was still something in the daylight, which is always the more reliable test. She wrote another piece the following evening, and another. She created a blog, no name on it, no photograph, just a title, unrecorded, notes from the margins of art. The first piece she posted was about the man in the dark coat in the north room portrait, about what it meant to be commemorated, without being known, to exist in paint for 3 centuries without a name attached. The blog found its first readers slowly. Priya read it. Clara read it. A handful of people she did not know found it through connections she could not trace. She did not mind the small numbers. She was writing because the writing did something necessary for her. It put the thinking into a form she could examine from the outside, which was different from the way it moved around inside her head without fixed edges. In the 4th week, the piece about the flower still life was shared by an art history account on a social platform, then by a museum educator in Amsterdam who described it as the most honest piece of writing about attribution she had encountered in years. Elena learned about this when Priya sent a message at 10:30 on a Tuesday evening in capital letters. Elena sat at her kitchen table and looked at the numbers, which were larger than she had expected. She read enough of the comments to understand what had happened, not simply that people were reading. The piece had touched something specific and real for people in the field, the particular loneliness of expertise that cannot be verified against the standard methods, the attachment that forms to an object regardless of its authenticated status, the genuinely difficult question of what value means when beauty is identical in the original and the copy, but convention expects you to feel them differently. She wrote her next piece that same night, until 2 in the morning, and stopped not because she had finished but because tiredness would begin to show itself in the sentences. She posted it the next morning. She did not call London. She did not announce anything. She simply worked at the house during the day and at the kitchen table in the evenings and let the writing find its own way in the world without her pushing it. Because the things that matter most tend to find their way when you give them space rather than force. And in that Edinburgh winter, in a flat with cold windows and yellow tulips and the castle visible from one corner, Elena Marsh began to become more fully herself. Not a different version, simply herself. More completely and more clearly, with less of the noise of other people's assessments competing with the things she actually knew to be true. She walked the city on weekends and learned the names of streets she had not known. She found a bakery 2 minutes from the flat that made bread so good she bought it twice a week and ate it at the kitchen table with good cheese and thought nothing more complicated than that it was very good bread, and she was glad she had found it. She called her mother on Sundays. She called Priya on Thursdays. She texted Clara photographs of things she found, a carved face above a doorway on a street she had discovered by accident, the exact shade of purple the sky turned over the castle at 4 in the afternoon on a clear day. She was not happy in the uncomplicated surface sense. She was something more durable than that. She was occupied. She was purposeful. She was making something that was genuinely hers, that had not been given to her by anyone, and could not be taken away by anyone, because you cannot take away work that has already been done. It was accumulated and real, and belonged to her, in the same permanent way that time you have already lived belongs to you. An email arrived from an editor at a publication she respected, asking if she would consider contributing regularly. They had found the blog. They liked what they found. She sat with the email for 2 days. She thought about it carefully. Then she replied, yes. She made soup. She went to bed. She slept well. This was what rebuilding looked like, she thought. Not a dramatic moment. Not a triumph with a defined arrival point. Just a daily accumulation of decisions to show up to the work and make it honest, one after another, until the accumulation added up to something that was indisputably yours, and would remain so regardless of what anyone else decided about it. In the weeks that followed the posting of the letter, Dorian Ashworth found himself in an unfamiliar relationship with the concept of waiting. He had posted it on a Thursday morning, and walked back from the postbox and sat down at his desk and continued with the estate correspondence as he had planned to. He was not given to sentimentality about his own actions. He had decided the letter needed to exist, had written it until it said what it needed to say, and had sent it. What happened next was not his to determine, and he was clear about this. He did not wait with anxiety. He waited with the particular quality of attention that is specific to situations where you have done the only thing you could do and the result is in someone else's hands. The estate work continued. He had sold the Edinburgh landscape in February. The auction had gone well and the sale had cleared the most pressing of the estate's deferred debts. He had negotiated a repayment schedule for a second tranche that was manageable within a revised income projection. He had spoken with the estate manager about the farming tenancies. He had reduced the London household to a sensible arrangement that he should have made several years ago. He had also established what he thought of as the collection program, a small and careful plan to acquire each year 2 or 3 works by living artists, chosen on the basis of quality rather than market position, documented properly, held in good conditions. He had started with a print by a photographer whose work he had seen at a gallery in Fitzrovia and which had stayed in his mind in the way that genuine things stay. He paid a fair price. He made a proper record. It was a small thing, but it was real, and doing it with care felt like the beginning of something that could be built from real materials rather than performed materials. He read more. He worked through his father's library with genuine attention and found, in the marginal notes of a man who had been considerably more honest in private than in public, something that surprised him. One annotation beside a passage in a book on moral philosophy said simply, "I should have been more honest with the people who needed me to be." He sat with that sentence in the quiet study one evening and felt, unexpectedly, something close to gratitude. He had dinner with his mother on Sundays in the Wiltshire house. She had stopped protesting about the move within 3 weeks of making it, which was roughly what he had predicted. She asked him once, over dinner in April, how he was finding things generally. "Clearer," he said. "Things are clearer." She gave him the long, accurate look she had given him throughout his life when she was assessing whether he meant what he said. She concluded that he did, and moved on to the subject of the lower field, and whether he had considered replanting it. It was Caroline Hartwell who mentioned Elena's blog. They ran into each other at a private view in Fitzrovia in March, stood together in front of an abstract painting they could not entirely decode, and agreed that it was probably very good. Caroline mentioned a blog she had been reading about art and the margins of it, a piece about a still life, the question of what value means when beauty is identical in the original and the copy, the most honest writing about attribution she had encountered in years. He found the blog on his phone on the tube home. He read 3 pieces standing in the carriage and recognized the voice before the end of the first paragraph. The same precision that had described the mirror technique in the Norfolk portrait, the same quality of looking past the surface of a thing to the question that lived behind the surface. He went home and read everything she had written, from the beginning, over 4 days. Each piece was a clear demonstration of the quality of attention he had been briefly in contact with at Whitmore Hall and had traded away in 2 seconds for the price of belonging in a room. The piece about the man in the dark coat portrait stayed with him longest, about what it meant to be seen versus merely looked at, about the particular loneliness of visibility without acknowledgement. He read it 4 times before he understood fully what it was doing. It was not an argument. It was not a complaint. It was a very clear and honest piece of writing about what it costs to be present in the world without being properly seen, written with the specificity of someone who understood the experience from the inside and had found a way to talk about it that was exact without being self-pitying. He thought, the letter was right to send, and then he thought about nothing in particular for a long time. Outside the study window, the May evening was carrying its particular reluctant light, the kind that stays because it wants to and leaves because it must. The street below was quiet. Somewhere in Edinburgh, in a flat with cold windows and work to do, a person he had failed and then tried to acknowledge was living a life that was, by all evidence, significantly more honest and purposeful than the one she had been living when he had briefly intersected with it. He hoped she had read the letter. He hoped it was right. He went to bed early and slept without difficulty, which was something that had been harder in the months before than it was now. He was beginning, slowly, to occupy his own life rather than the performance of it. The estate work itself continued to clarify him. Not in the way that difficulty is supposed to clarify a person, through suffering and its lessons, but in the more practical way that problem-solving clarifies, through the requirement to look at things directly and make decisions based on what is actually there, rather than what you wish were there. He found in this process that he was better at direct engagement than he had previously given himself credit for. He had been educated for a certain kind of management, the management of appearances, of expectations, of rooms. He had not been educated for the management of realities. The realities, it turned out, responded to direct attention in a way that the rooms never had. He took on more of the estate work personally. He had previously relied on a factor whose principal virtue was the avoidance of difficult conversations, a quality Dorian had valued, when the avoidance felt like peace, and now recognized as the deferral of costs that were simply accumulating elsewhere. He replaced him with someone more direct. The transition was uncomfortable. The first 3 months of it were the most uncomfortable thing he had done professionally in years, requiring him to have conversations he had been avoiding for a decade. He had them. They were difficult. Things improved. He also, in this period, did something he had not done since leaving Cambridge. He attended a series of public lectures, not art lectures, though those came later, history lectures, at an institution near the library where he had been spending his evenings. He sat in the back of the lecture hall in the ordinary way of someone attending a public event, and listened to a woman talk about the economic history of early modern England, about the gap between the recorded history and the actual history, about what you could recover from the margins of official accounts if you knew where to look. He thought about Elena's blog, about the gap between the visible surface of things and the reality beneath the surface, about the repeated motif of the unnamed and the unrecorded, and the information that lived at the margins of the official account. He was not drawing a direct line between these things. He was simply sitting in a lecture hall in the ordinary way, and noticing that the world kept producing versions of the same question, about what was visible and what was true, and how much distance there was between those two things. He wrote to no one about any of this. He did not need to. He was simply going about the work of becoming more accurately himself, which was a private process that required no witnesses and produced no particular drama. The letter was out in the world. He had done what he could do. He returned to the library in the evenings and read his father's annotated books, and thought about the young man laughing in the photograph outside the pub, and about the distance between the young man and the man who had written the marginal notes, and about whether the distance was a failure or simply the nature of time, and he found that he did not know, and that not knowing was itself a kind of information. The piece about the unnamed woman went further than anything Elena had written before. She had found the reference in a footnote in a catalog she was cross-checking for the Alderton documentation, a portrait listed in an 1874 estate inventory as the model of the well-known piece, no name, no other details. When she looked for the original record, she found the woman's name had appeared in an 1841 inventory and had been replaced, at some point in the intervening years, with the description, "Someone had made the decision to remove the name and leave only the function." She wrote about this for 2 evenings, about what it meant to be reduced from a person to a role in the record of a thing you had been part of making, about the specific weight of that kind of erasure, which was not dramatic, which left no visible mark, which could only be found by someone who knew to look for both versions of the record. The piece posted on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday evening, a link appeared from an account belonging to a curator at a major European museum. By Friday, it had been shared 300 times. By the following Monday, several thousand times. She sat at the kitchen table on Monday evening and read a selection of the responses. People were not reading it as a piece about a historical inventory. They were reading it as a piece about the experience of being unnamed. Curators wrote about it. Researchers wrote about it. People entirely outside the art world wrote about it from contexts she had not imagined. A woman in Montreal wrote about finding her grandmother, described in a family photograph caption as "woman in back," the grandmother's name known to the family but not thought worth including. The piece had touched something that was much larger than its subject. She had been precise and specific and had not generalized, and the precision was exactly what had allowed people to recognize something general in it. She called Priya that evening. "I do not quite know what to do with this," she said. "You do not need to do anything with it," Priya said. "It has done its own thing. You just wrote it." She sat with it and wrote the next thing. A piece about the practice of attribution itself, about the specific intellectual and ethical discipline of saying, "This is by this person," when the evidence allows it, and I do not know when it does not. About the temptation to fill the gap with a plausible guess and call it a conclusion. About the honesty that genuine scholarship requires, and the ways that honesty is inconvenient in a market that wants certainty. It was a different kind of piece, more technical, more specific to the field. It was read by fewer people but by the right ones. She received an email from a specialist at a university department who described it as one of the clearest articulations of attribution methodology she had read outside the academic literature, and who asked if she would be willing to speak at a symposium the following autumn on provenance ethics. She said yes to the symposium. She said yes to a second request from the journal editor for a regular column. She said yes to a request from a private collector in the Netherlands who had found the blog and wanted to engage her to review the provenance documentation for a collection he had inherited. The Edinburgh documentation work continued. The landscape had been sent to the first specialist on her list, a woman at the National Galleries who had spent 40 years studying the specific period. The response was not yet back. These things were never immediate. Elena continued with the rest of the collection. She found, in the East Wing, a portrait she had not expected, small, painted on copper rather than canvas or panel. A woman, middle-aged, sitting at a desk, her hands holding a piece of paper she was reading, her expression showing the precise quality of concentrated attention that is very difficult to paint convincingly. The painting was clearly by someone who had taken a great deal of trouble to capture the quality of a mind at work. There was something in the quality of the attention the painter had given to the subject's attention that was moving, the sense of one concentrated looking recording another, the two acts of focus holding each other in the paint for however many years the painting survived. She wrote about it that evening, not for the blog but for herself, in her notebook, about what it felt like to encounter something made with genuine care and to feel, in the encounter, that the care was still present, still available to be received, across however many years separated the making from the looking. She called Kate one evening in late spring. Kate was an architectural researcher she had met through the Alderton work and who had become the person Elena spent most of her social time with in Edinburgh, partly because Kate was genuinely interesting, and partly because Kate had the quality of engaging with whatever you were saying, without needing to make it about herself. They met at a restaurant near the Grassmarket and ate and talked about their respective work, with the ease of people who are not performing interest because the interest is real. Kate listened to the story of the portrait of the woman at the desk. Then she said, "What will happen to it?" "It will be documented and included in the collection catalog. It will stay in the house. The trust has been thinking about public access. Graham mentioned it. So the woman at the desk will eventually be looked at by people who did not know she existed until someone like you found her." Elena thought about this. "Yes," she said. "That is a good thing to spend your time doing," Kate said, simply and without ceremony. Elena looked at the table. She was surprised to find this had moved her more than she expected. A week later, the response from the National Galleries arrived. The specialist wished to arrange a visit to see the landscape in person. The language was careful and appropriately hedged, as specialist language always was at this stage. But the specific things she had asked to examine in person were the things you asked to examine in person when you had already formed a significant view. Elena read the email 3 times. Then she called Graham Forsyth. "Does this mean what I think it might mean?" he said. "It means she wants to look at it herself," Elena said, "which means she thinks it is worth looking at herself, which is not confirmation, but it is a very good sign." She put the phone down and went back to the east wing and the portrait of the woman at the desk, and she stood in front of it for a few minutes and felt the uncomplicated gratitude of being in the right place doing the right thing, which was not a feeling she had previously recognized as something she was entitled to feel, but which she was finding, in Edinburgh, was available if you showed up for it. The Copenhagen Gallery contacted her in November. They had found the blog through the museum educator in Amsterdam, and they had been reading it for 4 months. They wanted to know if she would be interested in discussing an exhibition based on the written work. Not a catalog, not an academic presentation, the writing itself, in a gallery space, alongside the images of the objects the writing was about. She sat with the email for a week. She turned it over and looked at it from every angle she could think of. She could not find a thing that was wrong with it. She wrote back, "Yes, I would be interested in discussing this." She put the phone down. She stood at the kitchen window in the November dark. The castle was a dark mass against a darker sky. The flat was warm in a way it had not been in December, partly because she had found the drafts and partially addressed them, and partly because she had simply stopped noticing the cold. She thought, things are happening because of the work, not because of anything else. Not because of who she knew, or what room she had been in, or whether someone had laughed at her at a party in October. Things were happening because she had done the work honestly, and the work had found its way to the people it was for. She thought, that is enough. That is, in fact, quite a lot. She had a coffee with Graham Forsyth in Edinburgh in October, before the contract formally concluded. He wanted to talk about the collection's future, the possibility of public access, the question of what a small, privately held collection of this quality could offer to people who would never otherwise encounter it. "The woman at the desk," he said, "the copper panel portrait. Do you think we could learn her name?" "It is possible," Elena said, "if the family records survive. If someone thought her important enough to mention by name in a letter or a diary from the period. These things are always dependent on what was thought worth keeping." "And what is it like," he said, "to look for a name and not find it?" She thought about this honestly, because it deserved an honest answer. "It is frustrating in the practical sense," she said, "but it is also its own kind of information. The absence tells you something. The fact that her name was not kept, or was removed, or was never in the record to begin with. That is a fact about the period, and about the people who managed the records. The absence is part of the history." He nodded slowly. He was a thoughtful man, and he had been thinking about the collection with a new seriousness since Elena's work had shown him what it contained. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what it would mean to restore the names where we can find them, to make the documentation part of the public experience of the collection, rather than something that sits in a folder in an office." Elena looked at him. "That is exactly the right idea," she said. And she walked back from the coffee to the flat, feeling the particular warmth of an idea that is the right idea, encountered in the right place at the right time. The kind of idea that makes work feel less like work and more like what work is supposed to be. The recognition that what you are doing matters beyond the technical specifications of what you are doing. She wrote about this too, not immediately, but over the following weeks, as the idea settled and clarified, about the difference between documentation as record and documentation as recovery. About the obligation that comes with finding a name, the obligation to say it, to put it back into the record it had been removed from, to allow the person to be present in the history of the thing they had been part of making. This piece became, when she eventually posted it in November, the most formally argued thing she had written, the most explicitly ethical. It was also, she thought, the most personal, because the argument it made was not only about collections and provenance and the obligations of curators. It was about what you owe to the presence of anyone who has been made invisible, which was a subject she understood from the inside, and from the outside, and from every direction in between. The Victoria and Albert Museum holds, among its many qualities, the ability to make an occasion feel simultaneously intimate and large. Its rooms are scaled to human attention without diminishing the objects in them. An evening event there has a quality that no other London venue quite matches, the particular sense of being inside accumulated knowledge, surrounded by things made by hands long gone, in a building designed with the genuine conviction that the past belongs to everyone. The autumn benefit auction was a quarterly private fundraiser, 180 guests, invitation only. Elena was there because a small bronze she had helped catalog was among the lots, and the museum's curatorial team had asked her to be available to answer questions about its attribution history. She had been back in London for 3 weeks. The Edinburgh contract had reached its natural conclusion in late September. All 462 works documented, the preliminary catalogue written. The 3 major works referred to the appropriate specialist processes. The National Gallery specialist had visited in July. She had stood in front of the landscape for 40 minutes and then said, in the considered way of someone who is very careful about what they claim, that she would like to examine it on 2 more occasions before forming a view. This was, as Elena had explained to Graham Forsyth afterward, approximately the most encouraging thing the specialist could have said without making an actual claim. She had left the Hartley collection in July over a lunch at which Geoffrey had been gracious, and had the look of a man slightly relieved at an outcome that had arrived without requiring him to act. She set up as an independent consultant, 3 clients by the end of August, a 4th in September. The Edinburgh Attribution, the Journal column, the blog's steady readership, the Copenhagen Gallery's interest. Together these had assembled into something that had not been planned but had been built, piece by piece, from real work. She rearranged the flat after Clara moved out. She bought a second bookcase. She put her desk at the window with the best light. The flat was entirely hers now, and she found she liked it that way, not because she preferred solitude in all things but because this particular quiet had been earned, which gave it a different quality from any quiet that had been imposed on her. The Copenhagen exhibition was confirmed for the 3rd week of June the following year. She had 6 months to prepare. 25 pieces, written work printed and framed, paired with images of the objects she had written about. She spent a day in September on a call with the gallery's designer, working through the questions of scale and font and how written words behave on gallery walls, which is different from how they behave on a page. She was particular about these decisions. She was particular about most things now, and had stopped apologizing for it. She gave a talk at the Courtauld Institute in November. 40 minutes on provenance ethics, an audience of 200. A Q&A that ran 30 minutes over schedule. She addressed the room with the complete attention she gave to any work she cared about. Priya sat in the front row. Afterward she said, "You were completely calm." "I was thinking about the argument," Elena said. "I forgot about the room." "That is the whole secret," Priya said. "People who are talking about the thing forget to be afraid of the room." She went to the Victoria and Albert benefit in a green dress that Clara had chosen when Elena sent photographs of the options. She arrived at 7:30 and spoke to the curator about the bronze and then moved through the evening with the ease she had been building steadily over the previous year. Not the ease of performance, but the ease of someone who has established their ground and knows where they stand on it. She was deep in a genuine conversation with a conservator from the British Museum, an interesting exchange about the ethics of displaying contested objects, when something at the edge of her awareness registered a familiar figure across the room. She did not stop speaking. She finished the thought she was in the middle of. She waited for a natural pause. Then she looked. Dorian Ashworth was near one of the display cases, reading the exhibition label beside a medieval casket with the absorbed attention of someone who is genuinely reading rather than appearing to read. He had not seen her. She returned to the conversation. She remained wholly present in it. Later in the evening, near the second lot's presentation, she found herself at the edge of a loose group. Dorian was in the group, in conversation with an older man who was speaking with his hands and the enthusiasm of someone engaged with his own subject. Dorian was listening with the full attention she had come to recognize as his genuine mode. He looked up and saw her. He gave a small, precise nod, the kind of acknowledgement that says, "I see you," without requiring any response. She returned the same. They each continued on their own paths. They did not speak that evening. There was no manufactured encounter. The event moved around them as events do, full of its own concerns. She went home in a taxi. She changed out of the green dress. She made tea and sat at her kitchen table and opened her notebook. She had been thinking for several weeks about a piece on restoration, specifically on the decision of how far to take a repair, whether to leave the restored surface visible, to let the history of the damage remain legible in the object, or to integrate the repair so completely that the damage became invisible. She had always believed in the first approach, let the repair be seen, let the history be honest. But writing about it required her to examine the belief and find the reason for it. She wrote for an hour. She wrote about what it meant to carry a history of damage visibly versus invisibly, what each choice communicated about the thing and about the person who had made the repair. She wrote about the difference between wholeness and the appearance of wholeness. She wrote about what it meant to survive something, and show that you had survived it, rather than concealing the fact of the survival. Then she wrote the line that had been assembling itself in the back of her mind for several months. The most interesting surfaces are the ones that have been honest about their own history, not the ones that have been made to look as though nothing happened, the ones where you can see the damage and the repair together, and understand that something survived. She read it back, then she read it back again. It was the truest thing she had written in a long time. She saved the document, she closed her notebook, she went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about the museum evening. about Dorian's nod from across the room, about what the distance felt like. It did not feel painful. It did not feel charged with unfinished things. It felt like exactly what it was, two people who had been in a significant moment together, who had met once afterward and said the true things, and who now occupied the same city and occasionally the same rooms, and did not owe each other anything more than the small, honest acknowledgement of each other's continued presence in the world. That is a clean thing, she thought. That is what resolution actually looks like. She thought about Copenhagen, about what it meant to build something in a place where none of the damage had happened. She slept. The London return had a quality she had not expected. She had expected to feel the weight of the city, the density of the history she had had in it, the presence of things that had happened in it. She felt some of that. But she also felt, more strongly than she expected, the sense that the city was simply itself, and she was simply herself, and the two things were not in conflict. She had coffee with Priya in a place near the Tate that they had been meeting at since they were postgraduate students. They sat for 2 hours and talked about the work and about other things, and at one point Priya said, out of the middle of a different conversation, "You seem different." "I am different," Elena said. "Better different," Priya said. "Not different like something was taken from you. Different like something was added." Elena thought about this. "More accurate," she said. "I am more accurate about things." "Including yourself?" "Especially myself." She thought about this on the walk back to the tube. She thought about the word accurate, which she had used without planning to, and which was exactly the right word. She was more accurate about herself than she had been before Edinburgh, before the gala, before all of it. More accurate about what she was capable of. More accurate about what she required from her professional life. More accurate about what she would and would not accept from people. Not in a defensive way, not with the brittle over-selectiveness of someone who has been hurt and is protecting against further hurt, but in the simple, honest way of someone who knows what is good for them and acts accordingly. Accurate was not a word that usually applied to persons. It applied to measurements, to instruments, to records, but it was the right word. She had become more accurate, more true to the actual thing she was. She thought about the painting of the woman reading, the domestic interior, the cat at the foot of the chair, the crack in the panel that had been the visible result of 300 years of small, unregistered movements. She had stabilized that crack. She had filled it and integrated the repair and returned the surface to something closer to its original wholeness, but the crack had been there. The crack was part of the history of the thing. The fact that it was no longer visible did not mean that the 300 years had not happened. She was not going to pretend that the 300 years had not happened. She was simply going to live forward from where they had brought her, which was here, which was better, which was hers. She walked home through the October streets, and London was cold and full and entirely indifferent to her, and she found that she did not mind the indifference at all. She did not need the city to acknowledge her. She had other sources for that. Dorian wrote the letter to Elena Marsh on 11 different days before he arrived at the version he posted. The first attempt was on a Wednesday evening in early March at the desk in his study, with the fire on and the rest of the house quiet. He had found the plain writing paper in the back of a drawer, not the embossed estate stationery, which would have been the wrong kind of formality. He sat down with a pen and wrote, "Dear Elena," and then he stopped. He stayed at the desk for 2 hours. He wrote 3 sentences and deleted them. He wrote a paragraph and read it back and deleted that too. Not because the sentences were wrong exactly, but because they were the sentences of a man who was still, at some level, managing the situation, rather than simply saying the true thing about it. He came back the next morning. The second draft was more direct but too brief, the directness of someone cutting to the conclusion without doing the work of getting there honestly. The third attempt was on a Sunday evening 2 weeks later. He wrote a full page before the letter began, again, to drift toward what he could comfortably say rather than what he needed to say, which is always the wrong direction. He understood the problem. He was reaching, automatically, for the version of the situation that was more comfortable for him than for the person he was writing to. Not dramatically, just the small adjustments that aggregate into a letter that is about managing the writer's discomfort rather than addressing the person it was written to. He set the third draft aside and went to his father's library. He sat in the chair his father had always used, more worn than any other piece of furniture in the room, still holding the shape of a person who had sat in it many thousands of times. He read for an hour without choosing a subject, just the kind of reading you do when you need your mind to be occupied with something other than what it is occupied with. He came back to the desk in the morning. The fourth draft was better. It had the shape of the right thing, an acknowledgement that was not hedged into meaninglessness. He read it through and found 3 places where he had still, without meaning to, softened the account in ways that tilted the responsibility slightly. He rewrote those 3 places. He read the revised draft. Better, still not right. He continued this process. Draft after draft over 11 days, each one closer to what he was trying to say, each one requiring him to find and remove one more layer of protective language that had crept in without his noticing. The language of context, the passive voice, the forward-moving sentences that moved too quickly past the description of the harm toward the description of what had changed since, as though the harm was a point to get through rather than the point itself. He read everything she had written on the blog twice more during those 11 days, not because he was building a case for himself, but because it continued to clarify the specific quality of what had been in the room at Whitmore Hall. In the piece about the man in the dark coat portrait, he found a sentence he kept returning to. The difference between being seen and being looked at is the difference between being present in someone's actual attention and being present in their field of vision. He read this sentence several times before he understood that it was a description of exactly what he had done. He had looked at her. He had not seen her. Looking was easy and required nothing. Seeing required you to bring the person into your actual attention, to let them be real in your perception rather than simply visible. He had looked. He had not seen. He wrote the final draft on a Thursday morning after a night's sleep that was unusually deep and complete. He sat down at the desk and wrote without stopping. He named the evening. He named what he had said. He named it as a choice, made in 2 seconds, that he was not going to describe as anything other than what it was. He wrote about reading her blog and named specific pieces and said what they had made him think, precisely and without ornament. He wrote about what the reading had clarified. He wrote, "I am not writing because I hope for anything in return. I am writing because what happened was wrong, and some things need to be said plainly in order to properly exist. You deserved much better than what I allowed that evening, and I know this clearly now, and I am sorry for it." He read it back. It said what it needed to say. It did not have anything in it that was there for his comfort, rather than the honesty of the exchange. It did not pretend to neutrality about what had happened. It did not dress the situation in the language of regret for how things landed, rather than regret for what was done. It was 2 pages. He addressed the envelope to the Edinburgh flat. He posted it on a Thursday morning, walking the 2 minutes to the post box himself. He returned to the house and went inside and sat at his desk and returned to the correspondence that was waiting. He had done the thing that needed doing. He would not be able to know, until and unless she chose to reply, whether it had arrived rightly. That uncertainty was entirely his to hold. He held it without drama, the way you hold something that is genuinely beyond your control, which is to say, not entirely comfortably, but without the alternative of pretending otherwise. He got on with his work. In April, 3 weeks after the letter, he woke one morning to the birds outside the window, and lay there listening to them for a long time before getting up. They were making a great deal of sound for 6 in the morning, the concentrated, organized noise of things that do not question their own existence or their right to occupy the space they occupy. He thought, I hope she is well. Not I hope for a reply. Not I hope something comes of this. Just, I hope she is well. He got up. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table rather than the desk, which was unusual. And he looked out the window at the London morning, attempting, not entirely convincingly, to suggest that summer was approaching. He thought about the Norfolk portrait. He had not moved it since returning it from the gala, and it hung in the hall at the end of the east wing of the London house where it caught the afternoon light from the window at the end of the corridor. He had developed the habit of walking down to look at it most evenings when he was in the house, standing in front of it for a few minutes, looking at the woman looking sideways at something he could not see, and thinking about the mirror that had created the doubled light in her collar, and about the woman from the Hartley collection who had noticed the mirror on the evening they first met, and had described it with the absorbed precision of someone who genuinely loved what she was looking at. He had written the letter. He had done what he could do. The rest was not his. He went to his desk. He opened the estate correspondence. He got on with his day. He discovered, in this period, that he was capable of enjoying things in a way he had not been for some time. This was not a dramatic discovery. It arrived slowly, the way most important things arrive, through the accumulation of small instances. He went to a concert at a small venue in Islington in late March, and sat in the dark listening to a string quartet play something he did not recognize, and found himself entirely inside the music, in a way that he could not remember happening before. He stayed afterward and spoke to the first violinist, who was precise and enthusiastic about the piece in the way of someone who has been thinking about it for months, and the conversation lasted 40 minutes and covered more territory than he had expected. He found that he was reading not just his father's books but his own books, books he had bought and never opened, books he had been given and set aside, Books he had meant to read for years and had always deferred to some future self who would have more time. The future self had arrived. He had the time. He read. He went to galleries. Not the kind of gallery event he had always attended, the private views and the fundraising dinners and the occasions whose primary purpose was the social fact of attendance rather than the art. He went to galleries in the ordinary way, on ordinary weekdays, and stood in front of things for as long as he wanted to stand in front of them. He found this restorative in a way he had not anticipated. He stood in front of the Norfolk portrait on an evening in May and looked at the woman looking sideways at something outside the frame. He had looked at this painting many times since the gala. He had looked at it differently each time, or rather, the painting had been the same and he had been different, and so the looking had been different. He thought about Elena's description of the mirror technique, the secondary light source, the doubled quality of the light in the woman's collar. He looked at the collar. He could see it now, the way the light seemed to come from two directions at once, the way it created that particular softness that was the result of reflection and not just illumination. He had had this painting for 6 years and had not seen this until Elena described it to him in a room full of people who were talking about other things. He thought about what it meant to look at something and truly see it, versus to look at something and register its presence without seeing it. He thought about the difference between the two experiences. He thought about what changed when you moved from the first to the second, about what became available when you were actually seeing rather than merely looking. He thought about the letter, about whether it had been the right thing. He thought it had been the right thing. He thought about the reply, which had not come, which he had not expected and was not counting on. He thought about what he hoped for, and found, honestly, that what he hoped for was very simple. He hoped that the letter had arrived in the right way. He hoped that the acknowledgement he had made had been received as the acknowledgement it was intended to be, which was genuine and without condition and without claim. He stood in front of the portrait for a long time that evening. Then he went back to his desk and got on with the work that was waiting for him, which was considerable and which he was, increasingly, good at. Elena found the letter on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of April. It had arrived 2 days earlier while she was at the British Library for a day's research into the provenance of the copper panel portrait from the Alderton collection, which she was now pursuing beyond the Edinburgh contract on her own time because the painting had stayed with her, and the woman at the desk deserved to have her history recovered if it was recoverable. The post on the doormat when she returned that evening had included the usual things and one cream envelope that she set aside without opening because she was tired and the evening required soup and sleep rather than correspondence of any kind. On Tuesday morning she picked it up from the kitchen table where it had been sitting, looked at her name written in the unfamiliar hand on the front, and opened it with her coffee. She read it once without stopping. She set it on the table and looked out the window at the street below. A woman with a pushchair navigating the curb with practiced ease. A man walking a terrier with the unhurried air of someone who has nowhere specific to be for an hour. The butcher's van making its Tuesday morning delivery. The morning going on around her, as mornings do, without particular interest in whatever was happening at the kitchen table above it. She read the letter again, slowly. She gave each sentence the attention she gave to a paint surface she was trying to understand properly, not looking for what she expected to find but for what was actually there. He had written about the ballroom without softening it. He had named the evening and named the moment and named what he had done, and had not surrounded any of it with context designed to make the action smaller than it was. He had said it was a choice, said it was wrong, and he had not dressed those words up. On the 2nd page he wrote about the blog. He named 2 pieces specifically and what he had thought about when he read them. The specificity had the ring of something that had actually happened to a person rather than something composed for effect. And then, I am not writing because I hope for anything in return. I am writing because what happened was wrong, and some things need to be said plainly in order to properly exist. You deserved much better than what I allowed that evening. She sat with the letter. The coffee was cold before she moved from the table. She thought about it from every angle she could find. She tried, honestly, to identify the places where the honesty broke down, or the language became a performance rather than a communication. She found a few places where the phrasing had the slight self-consciousness of something that had been revised more than once, which told her it had been revised, which was its own information. She found nothing that read as manipulation. She found nothing designed to produce a particular response from her rather than to say a true thing to her. She was not moved to forgive him immediately, and she did not pretend to herself that she was. Things needed to be examined before they were granted. Her own self-respect required the examination to be genuine. She also did not dismiss it. She sat with both truths at the same time. This letter might be right, and she was not yet ready to know what she thought about it. She called Priya that afternoon. Dorian Ashworth has written to me, by hand, about the ballroom. Priya was quiet for a moment. What kind of letter? The kind that does not ask for anything. Another pause. How does it read? Honestly, Elena said. Which is exactly what makes me careful. What do you want to do? Elena looked at the window. The April afternoon was gray and a light rain had started. I think I want to meet him once, to see what is real when the person is in front of me rather than on a page. That seems right, Priya said. She sat with the letter for 3 weeks. Not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted the decision to come from the right place. She went to the Alderton house for a final visit. She had dinner with Kate, who was always good company and honest about things in the way Elena found most useful. She wrote 2 pieces for the blog. She wrote her reply on a Friday evening in May, at her desk with the late spring light still in the sky. 4 sentences. She told him the letter had arrived and had been read with care. She said she was open to meeting once. She named a date 2 weeks away. She named the coffee shop in Bloomsbury where she had been going for 4 years, a place she knew, where she was known, where the room would already be hers before he arrived in it. She posted the letter that same evening. She walked to the post box in the May air and posted it and walked back and cooked dinner and ate it at the kitchen table and read for an hour before bed. She did not replay the decision. She had made it honestly from the right place. The next thing was simply to see what happened when the meeting occurred. The coffee shop in Bloomsbury was a place Elena had been going to for 4 years. It was narrow and warm and had 6 tables and very good coffee, and a blackboard menu that changed with the produce available. The woman who ran it, Frances, knew Elena's order without being asked. That was part of why Elena had chosen it. She wanted to be somewhere the room was already hers before he arrived. She arrived 7 minutes early. She ordered her flat white. She chose the corner table that faced the door and had the afternoon light from the window behind her. She sat down. She unwrapped her scarf. She placed her hands flat on the table, felt the coolness of the wood, and then moved her hands to her lap. She was calm. She checked this honestly and found that it was genuine, not the brittle surface calm of someone managing something larger underneath it, but actual calm, the kind that comes when you have thought something through completely and arrived at a position built on real ground. She watched the door. He arrived 3 minutes early. He came through the door in a dark coat and looked around the room with an expression of genuine uncertainty, the look of someone who does not know what he is about to walk into and is not pretending otherwise. He saw her. Something in his face settled, very slightly. He crossed the room. He said, "Hello, Elena." "Hello," she said. "Sit down." He sat. He took off his coat. He looked at the table and then at her, and then at the table again. She had not anticipated the nervousness. It was entirely unmanaged and entirely visible, the kind that can only be genuine because no one performing nervousness would allow it to show this clearly. Francis came to the table. He ordered black coffee. They waited while it arrived. He said, "Thank you for meeting me." "I was not certain I would," she said. "I know." She let a moment pass. Then she said, "I read your letter several times. I wondered whether I had said the right things," he said, "or whether I had said too much, or not enough of what mattered." "You said the right things," she said. "That is what made me careful." He looked at her. He did not reach for a response. He did not try to find the comfortable side of what she had said. He sat with it, which was the only correct response and which she noted. "I am not here to forgive you," she said. She said it plainly and without coldness. "I want you to understand that clearly. This is not a scene in which something is resolved and everything is made right. I am here because your letter was honest, and honesty deserved to be met with honesty." "Yes," he said, "that is exactly fair. What you did in that room was not a small thing," she said. "It cost me professionally. It changed the way I understood a conversation I thought had been real. You cannot undo that." "No," he said, "I know that." She looked at him. He was not arguing. He was not offering the careful language of someone managing their way through an apology toward a destination planned in advance. He was sitting with what she said as though it was true, because it was. "Why did you write?" she asked. "Actually, not the formal reason." He thought about this. He did not answer quickly. Then he said, "Because I read what you have been writing, and I understood clearly, and not comfortably, what kind of person had been in that conversation with me at Whitmore Hall. And I understood what I had traded it away for." He looked at the table for a moment. "And because some things need to be acknowledged before they can properly be set down, not for your sake, for mine, for the sake of being honest about what I actually chose to do." It was the most direct thing she could have imagined him saying, with the quality of a thought arriving in speech rather than speech prepared to sound like a thought. "I appreciate that," she said. They talked. Not about the ballroom anymore, that had been handled and was settled. He asked about the Edinburgh work and she told him about the landscape attribution and the morning when the specialist gave her view, and he listened with the full attention she had noticed at Whitmore Hall. She asked about the estate. He told her about the accounts and the decisions and the things he had learned from looking directly at what had been avoided. He was matter-of-fact about it, neither dramatizing nor minimizing. At one point, simply, without preceding sentence, he said, "I am sorry, Elena. I mean that without condition." She looked at him. She held the full weight of what the ballroom had cost her, not as a performance but as a genuine acknowledgement, because the cost had been real. Then she said, "I hear you. Not forgiveness, not absolution. The acknowledgement that the words had arrived and been received." She paid for her own coffee. He noted this without comment, which was the correct response. They stood to leave. He held the door and she walked through it into the Bloomsbury afternoon. She stood on the pavement for a moment alone. The sun was pale and the street was ordinary, and going about its business with complete indifference. She breathed the afternoon air. She was not sad. She was not swept into anything. She was present, which was the most honest thing she could have been. She had walked into a room that was uncertain and she had been herself in it, and she had walked out the same person, a little clearer, a little further along. She walked to the tube. She went home. She sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and wrote down 3 things she had noticed that day she wanted to remember. The particular quality of nervousness in a man who is being completely honest, the way an apology that asks for nothing feels different from every other kind, the specific afternoon light through the window of a small coffee shop on a side street in Bloomsbury in May. She was already thinking about the piece she wanted to write. That was the correct proportion of things. She spent the week before the meeting not preparing for it in any deliberate sense but simply continuing with the life she had been building, which was the best preparation available. She worked on the copper panel research at the British Library on Tuesday and Thursday, finding in a family correspondence archive from the 1780s a letter that mentioned in passing a woman called Eleanor, who sat for Old Chambers in the spring, Old Chambers being the name of a painter who had worked in Edinburgh in the period that matched the painting's style. Eleanor was not a common name in the period, and the reference to sitting was specific enough to be promising. She photographed the letter and made her notes, and walked out of the library into the afternoon with the particular feeling of a thing that has not yet been confirmed but is beginning to take shape. She had dinner with Priya on Wednesday at a place near the Tate. They talked about the Edinburgh work and the Copenhagen preparations and about a mutual friend who was doing something interesting in Vienna. Priya asked, carefully and without pressure, whether she had thought more about the meeting on Friday. "I have thought about it the right amount," Elena said. "Which is, not so much that I have over-prepared for it, and not so little that I have avoided thinking about it. I know what I want to say, and I know what I do not need to say, and I know what is mine to give and what is not." "That is," Priya said, "a very Elena answer. Is that a good thing?" "It is an accurate thing," Priya said, which was the same thing. She walked home through the May evening, which was warm in the particular way of a city that has been cold for months and has finally decided to allow warmth back in. She thought about Friday. She thought about what the meeting was and was not. It was not a scene of forgiveness. It was not a scene of reconciliation. It was not a scene that needed to be followed by a series of further scenes leading to a conclusion she had already decided on. It was simply a meeting, an opportunity to see what was real when the person was in front of her rather than on a page, an opportunity to say what needed to be said in person, rather than through the mediation of letters and distance. She had written the true things on her walls, in Edinburgh and now in Copenhagen. She had said the true things in a small coffee shop in Bloomsbury on a May afternoon. She was still saying the true things, daily, in the work she was doing. These were the things that mattered, and they were hers, and they would continue to be hers regardless of anything else. The rest was simply what it was, an evening in a city she loved, a conversation she was curious about, a future she was walking toward with her eyes open. She got home. She made dinner. She sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and wrote a few lines about the letter in the family archive, about Eleanor who sat for Old Chambers in the spring, about what it meant to be named in passing in someone else's letter, the involuntary residue of an ordinary mention becoming, 250 years later, the thread that might recover a name from the margins of a history that had not thought her important enough to mention directly. She wrote, "History does not always preserve the people it should preserve, but sometimes, if you look carefully enough at the margins of what was kept, you can find them anyway." She closed the notebook. She went to bed. She slept. The Copenhagen exhibition opened on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of June, and the sky was still light at 9 in the evening, the particular northern light that stays past all reasonable expectation and that Elena had been looking forward to since she booked the flights in January. She had arrived the previous day. The city had the quality it always had at this time of year, the ease of a place that has decided to be pleasant, and is doing so without effort or announcement. She walked from the gallery to her hotel, through streets that smelled of water and bread, and the specific air of a city built close to the sea. She stood on the small bridge over the canal near her hotel for 20 minutes, because the light on the water at 7 in the evening was doing something she wanted to see for long enough to actually see it, rather than simply register it in passing. The installation was finished. She had been there on Tuesday for the final adjustments, standing in the rooms with the gallery's director and the designer, looking at the printed pieces on the warm gray walls with the afternoon light falling across them. She had made 2 small changes to the positioning in the second room, and then stood back and said, simply, yes, because that was the only word for it. The director nodded. The designer looked pleased. They had coffee in the small office at the back of the gallery and talked about something else, which was exactly what you do when a thing is finished and right and needs no further discussion. The morning of the opening she spent walking. This was something she always did when she was somewhere important, walked without a specific destination and let the city come to her in whatever order it chose. She found a market she had not known about and bought cheese from a woman who was enthusiastic about it, with the specific enthusiasm of someone who has been making it the same way for 30 years and believes this is worth being enthusiastic about. She sat on a bench near the water and ate the cheese with bread from the adjacent stall and watched the boats and the light and thought about nothing that would not improve from being thought about later. By 5 she was back at the hotel. She dressed carefully, not because the occasion required elaborate preparation, but because it deserved attention. She wore a dark red dress she had bought in Edinburgh, a color Kate had told her, firmly, was exactly right for her. She put on the pearl earrings her mother had given her when she finished her master's degree. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment without analysis, then went downstairs. The gallery was a 15-minute walk. She did not take a taxi. She wanted the walk, the specific quality of arriving somewhere on foot, of earning the arrival through the movement toward it. The rooms were already lit when she arrived. The gallery's staff, who knew their jobs and did them without fuss, were completing the final preparations. Frederica, the gallery's director, a woman who had been direct and warm and entirely professional throughout the months of planning, greeted her at the door and walked with her through the rooms one last time. They said very little, because there was very little that needed to be said. The first guests arrived at 7. By 7:30 the rooms had the quality of occasions that are going right. A particular quality of attention that fills a space when people are genuinely engaged rather than performing engagement. Elena moved through the evening with the ease that had been building in her over the past 2 years. Not the ease of performance, but the ease of someone who knows what they are doing and knows why. She spoke with a museum director from Brussels who had been reading the blog since the Unnamed Woman piece. She spoke with a collector from Oslo who had brought his daughter, who was 16 and studying art history, and who asked the most interesting question of the evening. Do you think the paintings mind that we look at them? Elena thought about this and said, I think the paintings are indifferent, but I think the looking matters to us, and that is probably the more important thing. The girl wrote this down. She spoke with a researcher from the Rijksmuseum who was working on a survey of Dutch still life attribution and who was interested in the Alderton flower piece, whose status was still not definitively resolved. They spoke for 20 minutes and Elena told her what she knew and what she had not been able to determine. And the researcher was exactly the right kind of interested in the open question rather than the settled answer. She noticed at 7:20 that Dorian Ashworth had arrived. She had not been watching the door. She did not need to. He came through it with the attention of someone who has arrived somewhere they wanted to arrive and is taking the time to see where they are. She saw him before he saw her. She continued the conversation she was in. He had come. She had sent the details in December, as she had said she would. He had replied simply, I will be there. Thank you for inviting me. She had not followed up because the simplicity of the exchange was exactly right, and adding to it would have diminished it. She went to him after the main rush of arrivals, when the rooms had settled into their evening rhythm. He was in the second room, in front of the piece about the man in the dark coat, reading it with the quality of attention she had seen him give to the Norfolk portrait on the night they first met. He turned when she approached. He said her name. You came, she said. I said I would. They looked at each other for the brief moment that contains the things which do not need words, because they have already been said, in letters and coffee shops and the long, quiet process of 2 people changing in the same general direction without coordination or agreement. I have been looking at all of it since I arrived, he said. And, she said. He thought about this with the seriousness she had learned to expect from him when a question was real. I think you have made something that will still be being read in 30 years, he said. Which is a longer answer than you probably wanted, but it is the honest one. She looked at him. She let the compliment exist without deflecting it, which was something she was still learning to do. Come to the entrance room, she said. The first piece is in there. They walked through to the room that contained the piece that would be the first thing anyone read when they came through the main doors. It was on the wall facing the entrance, the 12 sentences she had rewritten 4 times before they were right. She stood beside him and read her own words. She read, "The most interesting surfaces are the ones that have been honest about their own history, not the ones that have been made to look as though nothing happened. The ones where you can see the damage and the repair together, and understand that something survived." He stood beside her and read. She waited. He said, "It is the best thing you have written." "Yes," she said. "I think it might be. And it is about more than paintings." "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked at her. The room was quiet around them, the sounds of the rest of the evening coming from the other rooms like something heard from a good distance. The June light was still in the high windows, deep blue and unreasonable, committed to lasting past when it was supposed to. He said, "I am very glad you came through the other side of what I helped cause. I know that is a strange thing to say." "It is not strange," she said. "I did not come here to ask for anything. I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said. "I know that." She looked at the words on the wall. She thought about the ballroom, not with pain, which had long since been resolved into something different, but with the clarity of someone who can look at the thing from the right distance and see its full shape. She saw the whole of it from where she was standing. The gravel forecourt and the cold and the drive to Bristol and the Edinburgh winter and the North Room, and the man in the dark coat and the yellow tulips in a glass on a kitchen windowsill, and the letter and the coffee shop in Bloomsbury in May, and the 18 months of work that had accumulated into what was on these walls. She had needed all of it. The damage had been the condition of the repair, and the repair was what was standing in this room. She looked at Dorian. She looked at him without the layer of unresolved things, because those things had been resolved one by one in the time it took to build what was here. She saw a person who had failed her badly and been honest about it without making the honesty into another way of taking something. She saw a person who asked good questions when he was genuinely in a conversation, and who was, at this moment, genuinely in this one. She saw a person who had become, over the same period she had become more fully herself, more fully himself, and who was different because of it, in the ways that matter. "Would you like to have dinner?" she said. Something in him settled. "Yes," he said, "I would." They walked out of the gallery together, into the Copenhagen evening. The sky was still light, the long northern light that would not give up, that extended the day past all expectation into something that felt, if you let it, like a gift. The streets were warm and full, people moving through the summer evening with the ease of a city that is comfortable being exactly what it is. She did not know what would happen next. She had made her peace with not knowing. She knew only what was true in this moment. She had built something real and it was on the wall behind her, and she was walking forward into an evening in a city she had grown to love, in the company of a person she was genuinely curious about, and the air was warm and the light was long and she was entirely, completely, undeniably herself. This was not the ending of a story that had started badly. Endings and beginnings were simpler than this. This was the continuation of a life, her life, lived honestly through the worst of what had happened, and the best of what she had made from it, and continuing forward now into whatever the future was going to turn out to be. She thought, briefly, about the woman in the Norfolk portrait, looking sideways at something just outside the frame, knowing something she had not decided whether to share. "I understand you better now," she thought. "I understand the expression. I understand what it costs to keep something true in you when the world is busy looking at the permitted version, and I understand what it feels like when the truth of you finally has the space it needs to be exactly what it is." She walked. The evening held. The light continued past when it was expected to end. The street turned and the restaurant appeared at the end of it, warm and lit and entirely ready for whatever was about to happen inside it. She had come a long way to arrive here. She had been arriving, she understood, for quite some time, and the arriving had been all of it, every step and every choice and every day at the desk and every piece of work done honestly, and it was all here with her now as she walked through the door. The evening began.